Welcome once again for our weekly drop-in session. This week we're looking at roles and responsibilities. I wanted to talk a bit more about roles and responsibilities a bit more generally. So we're going to look at how we do the roles and responsibility modelling using tools like RACI or RACI or similar within Skore in a little bit. But I also want to talk about the sort of general roles and responsibilities within process improvement and talk a little bit about what roles and responsibilities are. So you'll see on my screen here that I have I've listed out the topics, and I kind of listed these out in terms of in the way that I was thinking about these topics. So I'm actually going to present them in a slightly different order than what I've laid out here. And I'm going to start just to talk a little bit about what we mean by roles and responsibilities, because it's quite a broad term, I think, or it can sort of touch on lots of different things. And again, what I want to get to is the sort of crux of some of the questions that we get as to when to use things like RACI type models, because they're not always appropriate in all situations. So I've just done a very quick breakdown here, and I said, just to think about processes describe the work that happens within a business or within an organization. So they're describing what happens. Roles are the people involved, or a particular role that someone's playing at a particular point within a process. So the roles tell us who's involved in the work, and then responsibilities are essentially that relationship between the roles and the work that's happened. So they tell us specifically what a role is doing within a process. And so when we look at a sort of typical box or activity within Skore, as I've got here, we've got an input and an output. So the main text in the what box describes the work that happens, the activity. We can see here we've got a role called finance admin. So that's the finance admin is the role. The responsibility is the finance admin doing this review supplier information, that specific activity. So in most cases, when you're using Skore, that is your roles and responsibilities will be the role and what it is that they're doing within a given process. Now, again, what we also provide within Skore is the ability to model processes and apply responsibility models such as RACI, RACI, and so on. And I'll touch a little bit more on those in a second. But where we tend to use those is often where we're going to define processes at a slightly higher level. So you'll see in my first example here, we've got invoice incoming from a supplier. The finance admin is going to review the supplier information. So it's quite a low level activity. And what they're doing is they're checking to make sure that's an approved supplier on the system. So all they're doing is they're looking at the supplier information. They look to check to make sure they're an approved supplier, and then they're going to move to the next activity in that process, which might be inputting the information from the invoice, which is different from the second example I've got here. So again, we've got the same input, incoming invoice from supplier. This time the activity is called process incoming invoices. And at the end of that, the invoice is approved for payment. So you can see that's a much higher level activity. There's much more going on within that particular step in the process. But in this case, in this example, what we haven't done is we haven't gone down to that next level of detail to start defining all the individual steps. And so what we've done here is we've then, because we haven't gone to that level of detail, it might be that we do later on, but right now we haven't. We know that there are multiple people involved in doing that process. And so this is where something like RACI or RACI comes in very handy, because we can then define, look, we've got process incoming invoices. Well, the finance manager has the overall accountability for doing for that activity, i.e. they're accountable for making sure it happens. The finance admin is the person who's doing most of the work, so they're responsible for the work. But at various points within that process, we might need to consult with the procurement coordinator, so they've been identified as a C. And we also want to let the buyer know that the invoice has been received and improved. So the buyer is an eye for Inform to let them know. So that's just to sort of give you an idea of when you'd use each of those two types of models within Skore. So again, it might be that you never need to use something like RACI, but other times it's quite useful for doing that. One of the examples I'll show in a second is a marketing example, and often there's things like engineering, creative type processes are often good for RACIs, just like they are for things like project management, where you know at a high level what needs to be done, you know what the outcome is, but the details of actually how it gets done and who's going to do it, each individual thing might not be known until you actually do the thing, if that makes sense. So you can define a responsibility level high up. So it gives us a quick overview of what we mean by roles and responsibilities and two slightly different ways of applying them. I'll come back to that in a second. What I did want to then touch on is just sort of reinforcing some of what we've been sharing over the last year in terms of how to actually go about running process improvement activities within the organization and thinking about how you break the work up. I did just want to talk about the roles and responsibilities specifically within process improvement. This is quite a high level. It's just more about the roles and the responsibilities, but I'll touch a little bit on on some of these, who these people are and what they might be doing. But this is not an exhaustive list, but these are the common roles that we'd see within the process improvement sphere. You'll see that I've actually grouped them together, sort of three different groups, and let me just talk a little bit about them. So what we see most often is that there is some sort of central or dedicated team that is looking at process improvement or continuous improvement or operational excellence, business process management, often called lots and lots of different things. One of the common terms we hear for this team is the Center of Excellence. It's another one. And again, they may have lots of different roles within them, but the sort of key ones that I think about here. So I've called the process improvement leader or lead, and that's the person ultimately looking after that sort of central team of analysts, process mappers, workshop facilitators, internal consultants. These are the people that will be going out and working with various parts of the business to help them document processes, identify improvement opportunities, and then implement those improvement opportunities. Often lots of things like training and so on. Then over on the right hand side, we've got the sort of the key group of people, if you like, who are the people who own and do the processes. And so I've got a process owner. I've got what I call the process champion, so I'll come back to that in a second. And then process performer. And so what I mean by the process performer is these are the people who actually do the process. So most cases, they will be the people whose roles sit against the boxes within the process. So the process owner is the overall owner of that end-to-end process, if you like, and they're accountable for making sure that process gets done. And the process performers are the people that do the work within the process. Now, the process champion is quite an important role, because often with a lot of these processes, while the process owner has that accountability for making sure that the processes are delivered, that they're continuously optimized and improved, it's often the term we use is the process champion is often the person who's actually has the sort of day-to-day running of that improvement and optimization work. So the process champion tends to be the one that works closely with the process analyst from the core team. In some organizations we work with, there's actually a kind of bit of a blurred line between those. So the process analyst is often the person, as I said, doing the mapping or the workshop facilitation or the sort of analysis work. Often those activities and skills by the process champion. So it's more like a distributed team. So the process champion is the one who's actually doing the work of the mapping and analysis, so on, but might be trained or supported by a central team. In other models, we see the process champion might not be technical enough to be doing the mapping and analysis work, but certainly will be responsible for making sure that process reviews happen, that review sessions are organized, managing KPIs and process performance indicators and that sort of thing. But that person is it's a key link between the central team and the actual operational teams within the organization. So they're quite key. And we certainly recommend, if you don't have that type of role already, thinking about how would you fit that into the existing teams. The other two that I've got down here, I've called stakeholders, and maybe I should have called these other stakeholders rather than stakeholders, because in a way, almost everyone on here is a stakeholder of some kind or another. But what I'm kind of call out here in terms of stakeholders is are the people outside of that core process team who need the information that's being documented or captured within those processes, whether it's just the standard documentation of the process, or whether you're looking at the process for driving requirements out, that sort of thing. So to give you an example of who those type of stakeholders might be, if you were looking at some sort of digital transformation program, implementing some sort of automation technology, it might be the stakeholders or the automation team that are taking the requirements from the process and then implementing them into an automation platform. Or it could be an ERP implementation or systems implementation team. It could be a compliance team who are looking at how the processes support the compliance. And again, there's the connection often with the process champion and those different stakeholders and different teams across the business. And then again, I've called out the subject matter expert, excuse me, subject matter expert here. Again, they're a type of stakeholder, but it's worth calling them out as a separate one, because what they're often doing is, when you're looking at the process or a process, they're bringing expertise that might be from within the specific process area, but could be from somewhere else. So it might be that they are, again, coming in from perhaps compliance, and they're advising the process team on how they can be compliant. So when you're doing any sort of process improvement work, it's worth just thinking about who these different roles are, whether they're required for your particular piece of work, because it might be that you have all the skills you need within the team. The process champion might be good enough for, might have all the skills for doing the documentation, and all you need to do is document standard processes, and that's it. You might have it all in there. But actually, if you do need to draw subject matter experts in from other parts of the business, or you're feeding information to other stakeholders, so it's a good idea just to get a good overall view of who the different roles are, what their place is within the initiative or exercise you're doing, and pull them in as required. So I just wanted to sort of bring that out, because I had a conversation the other day about roles and responsibilities with somebody. I was thinking about doing things like RACI modeling within processes, and they were actually asking about who needs to be involved in these projects that we're delivering. So I wanted to bring those two things together. But before we actually go into a process, just want to touch on the two most common models that we see. There are others available and possible to use within Skore. So the most common one by far and away we see is RACI, or RACI, as some might call it. RACI stands for Responsible, Accountable, Consult and Inform. And I've put in here a very crude description of what I believe each of these to be. So when we talk about responsible, we talk about the person responsible, or the role responsible for doing the thing, the activity or the work. When I talk about accountable, I tend to talk about the personal role who's accountable for making sure that the thing is done. So they're the ones that own the KPI, if you like, against that thing, although they might not necessarily be doing it. You might have a different role who's responsible for doing the thing. Consult then is anyone who needs to be consulted while the thing is being done. So, if we have to go off and ask questions of somebody, or get them to look at something or review something, so they're not a core part of the work, but they are an important part of the work, it's important to call them out. And a number of projects I've worked at, there's been, a number of projects I've been involved in the past. Understanding this consult layer has actually been one of the key parts of what the organization was trying to do, because they recognized that some pieces of work were quite complicated, required support from different parts of the business, but often, well, it's not my job because it's that team's job to do it. And so defining the processes and then being clear about when someone was required to consult on a piece of work meant everyone could say, okay, yes, I can legitimately go and ask that team for help because we've all agreed that they're part of the consult. And then the last one on here is in inform. So anyone who needs to be informed when the thing is done. So again, very, very simple. What I do find though, on most projects that I've been involved in using this type of modeling, we tend to focus just on the responsible and the accountable, unless, as I said, there was a specific problem where we were trying to work out how different teams were all involved in the processes. Then we brought consult in. You sometimes find if you try to do a RACI, the full RACI across every activity in a process, you end up with these big long lists of roles, which can be quite difficult to manage. And then people don't tend to look at it, and it overcomplicates the documentation and so on. It probably works better in high level project management, but it is, you can put all that information in. If you focus just on the RNA, it's really powerful, especially for things like organizational design, because you can really use that to drive out job descriptions from within Skore. So that can be quite useful. And then just below here, I won't spend too long on it, but I talk about the international version, RACI, and the reason this that I've put this in here is one of the big debates within RACI all the time is the difference between responsible and accountable. Now, when using English, it can be quite easy. I say easy, it's not easy, but it's probably relatively easier for us to define a meaning for each of these and then stick that on the wall and say that's the meaning that we're all going to stick to when we're using RACI. One of the challenges is in some languages, responsible and accountable translates into the same word. And so it becomes then harder to make that differentiation between the two. So the RACI is a model that we came across 10, 15 years ago, which just helps make it a little bit clearer. And so when they talk about responsible here, it's more like the accountable, the person responsible for making sure the thing is done. Authority is more about decision making. So you use it when there's a key decision, like a key go, no go type step in a process. And then task is more like what responsible was in RACI. So T, and the language is a bit clearer. Task suggests you've got a task to do within that particular process. Support is very similar to consult. There's an expectation that someone is going to support this process but isn't heavily involved in it, and then inform stays the same as it was before. I saw there was a question just come in. So if in a process an activity is a receive email notification of new opened matter is sent to stakeholders, would we use inform for these roles? That's quite interesting. So receive email notification of new opened matter. So my initial thing when I see that one is I always think an activity that starts with receive is a tricky one, because often you're not technically doing anything when you receive something, unless it is that you're picking that up and reviewing it in some way before you do something with it. But if part of the activity is to send information to all stakeholders, I'd probably call that out as a separate activity rather than put a role, list all the stakeholders and put inform on it. Like, because you're saying in this process we need to notify all the stakeholders that this new matter has been opened. Therefore, I'd call that out as a specific activity rather than trying to use inform. I think that would keep it simpler. Does that make sense? going to take that as a yes. Brilliant. Thank you. Excellent. Okay, so what I'm going to do, to realize time's running on, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to jump into an example process just to quickly show you an application of RACI in this case. So first things first, when you're in a process, I'll just jump in and go into edit mode in this process. You can define the responsibility model at the workspace level. So in the workspace, you need to go to admin. And then within the admin panel, there is a section called responsibility model. And in there, you can choose what your default responsibility model is. So if it's RACI, I think we provide rapid. And then if you use something like RACI or whatever, there is an ability to create a custom model too. If you've already been using Skore and processes, but without responsibility model, you might need to switch it on. So I'll just quickly show you where that is. The bottom left-hand side of the page is the map properties button, and within there's an option for responsibility model. And there you can see I've got RACI already selected there. If you've got custom ones, they'd appear on this list as well. And then basic is no responsibility model. So that's the sort of standard option there. So once I've got the responsibility model switched on, when I double click on a what box within Skore, you'll see where we've got the role identified. We basically get the buttons there for the RACI, and then you can tag them. You can have, for any one role, can have multiple responsibilities. So if I want to make this RNA, I can tag them both at the same time. So you can just tag each one as what it needs to be. And again, if you weren't aware as well, you can add multiple roles to a box. So I just click the add role box. I type in whatever the role is, and then I can click the actually just to show you, I'll put an employee in, and I'll put something like consult just to show that there. And when I click there, that can appear on the box as well. Now, as I mentioned before, one of the things that can happen, especially if you're using RACI quite strict, you can end up with big, long lists of roles on the boxes. And that might be important, especially for reporting and analysis purposes, but it doesn't always look nice on the process diagram, so it can get quite busy. And what you do have is the option to actually hide some of the roles. So you'll still have them when you click to edit like this, they'll still be visible, but they here, but they won't be visible in this editing view here. And the way we can do that is to go to the attachment panel. So when we click on the attachment panel, it opens on the left, and you'll see there is a responsibility section there. And if I open that up, you can see my two roles are shown, and then there's a little visible little eye button there, and if I click on that, it hides it from the process diagram itself. So the role is still associated with the activity. If I run the reports, it'll still come up against it. If I go and look at the roles report, for example, it will still be in there, but it's hidden visually from the diagram. That makes it a bit easier. Now, the other thing I just want to point out on this one, although I'm using it as an example, you'll see on my other boxes, and certainly this one when I first came in here, that on all of these boxes where there's a detailed view, I'd only tagged the role with an A. So that's because where there's a detailed box, typically there's going to be more steps underneath there, and they're often done by different people. So at this level, we tend to just put the accountable, i.e. the person responsible for making sure the thing gets done, rather than the person doing the thing. So that person might be doing the thing in the details, but at this level, because we're going to define it down there at this level, we tend to just keep it with the A in this case. Or again, I realize that some people actually swap the meaning of RNA the opposite way around to the way I use them. So you would do it that way around if that was the case. And then if I click on one of the detailed views, I go down into the detailed views, and you can see here where we started to then define the other types, the R's, the A's, C's, and I's. Now, interestingly, here we've got some steps where we've got head of marketing with an A in there and a C, or head of marketing with an A over there. It worked for me. That one works quite well because that's an approve. But generally, I probably wouldn't put, at a low level like this, I probably wouldn't put an A on there unless, as I said, there was some sort of approval or like decision-making step in there. I think because you've already put that role as the A and the level above it probably doesn't need to be in there. It's a, it's not a kind of hard and fast rule, but I find it just makes it a bit tidier for those bottom level processes. One of the things that Colin reminded me of, we were just talking about this just before coming on the call, just to reinforce the idea as well. If you remember in the 5 steps to the perfect process, which is our sort of iterative approach or methodology for how mapping a process, we always talk about define the title and scope first, define the activities, the key steps in the process, then define the outputs, and only after you've done all of that would we then recommend you put the roles against the boxes. It's exactly the same whether you're using RACI or not. What we find is that in that first pass of looking at the process, you want to kind of think about the process without the people involved, because you often end up in that sort of thinking where you're going, all right, well, once I finish this piece of work, I hand it back to that person, and that leads you into creating often feedback loops in your process that aren't really feedback loops at all. It's actually a completely different activity or completely new activity in there. And you also sometimes start to feel constrained about, well, that's done by that person, so it has to sit over there and so on. So it's really important to kind of think about the process without the roles and put the roles on later. That's the best practice approach that we found for doing this. And then finally, what I do is once you've obviously put your roles and races against this, we can then produce reports and look at that. So if I go over to the business tools, and I'll start obviously with the roles, I'm going to take someone like head of marketing in this case. But so as hopefully you'll know, if you're within a process and you go to the business tools and click on roles, systems, reports, the information it's going to show you is going to be specific to that process. If you want to look at everything in the workspace, you need to go back to the workspace view and click on it from there. So this is filtered very much to this view. You can see here it's showing me how many times each role appears on the process, and then the list of roles down the left-hand side. So if I take someone like, I was going to say head of marketing, for example, click on that. That opens up the roles, the role description for head of marketing. And so here what you can see is, again, all the activities as you'd normally see, but you also have the then the RACI or responsibility level against it, the RAC and I. And this is where it becomes really, really useful for defining job descriptions, for example. It might be that you need to pull multiple roles out and put them together, but you can now start to kind of really clearly define what is a role accountable for and what are the different things that they'd be doing as part of their job by separating out the accountable and responsible in there. Okay, well, thank you very much once again. We're going to be looking at identifying and I think measuring automation opportunities. So looking at the processes and trying to identify steps within the process that are suitable for automation and how you can highlight those. And I think there's Colin running that next Wednesday. So look forward to seeing you all then.